ya maju namje tadani bi simje tamje ge de topjalana me ba yang da ba to we sanje go ma ri bu ji chine ja to bara cha ti che do tambe che sambo se ne be bu ku je ge ri ma na le ba se da te sem ba shu kan sem ba che be tambe che de da changju la mu chi be ani nangje ta la ton chi be ko ke ka la ti ni ji ton ni to be shara be ka ja wu su ma se de la ta sab ji 다 요와 나니 랑루기 가장 외수마게로와 가장 외수에게 같은 디니마 주에지 하데레 디무티니 슈기스
Everybody begin by cultivating the thought very clearly in your mind that you're listening to this Dharma teaching in order to attain the most precious state, the highest state possible of complete perfect Buddhahood. In order to be of benefit for the sake of all mother sentient beings who are infinite, like the infinite space, who are limitless, and that you will do whatever it takes in order to achieve that state. And so where we are in our discussion of the Dharma, and the text we're in is the great treatise on the stages for the path to enlightenment by Lama Tsongkhapa, and within that there's the general section which is called the Great Insight. So that's the bulk of volume 3 in the English translation, and where we're in within this section is in this, the more then within that there's a subsection of identifying the object to be negated. And that's where we will continue now.
도체 다 대한 강사 rangi ngoni ki 주바 짐바 힘베 rangi 친이 ki 주바 나오 님도 짐바오 마이 짐비 지다 양은 대춘에 셔바 차오스다 어디 딘다 디값수 가리다 그 순거스나 다 지다니 여와 뭐 지다니 여와 마이와 말신 지다당 마이와 짐비 지다니 기 쳐버디로와 지다니 기 남비 쳐버디 시고르와 군이 지다 임바와 랑이 강사 랑이 친이 주바스미 강사게 당신 임바 지바체 다 딘나니로와 말신 지다 세데 가스나 나 강사와 탄예도 유비 강사 딘이 아니 미네 나오 냠도 드니 랑이 친이 주바 와 나오 냠도 랑이 친이 주바 지바체 말신 지다 세데 다 나유비 천신 민나소라 미네 디 나이스와 나이 롱제자르스 야나 나티니 테 롱조바 보지 마스 오다 디라 말가스나 나이와지 지다스 다 레소와다 지다니 다 지다세디 쪼디 아니 강사 당진이 바 짬마이 바 랑주기와 데니 나당 나이와 카룰라 미네 아니 랑이 친이 주바스 로 친지로 지체 와 다음 랑주기 몽고 탐지게 짜와 지경이지 딘데 지체 다 딘데 왜 나라더니 지단니 전에 나르짐바당 나이르짐바 세기 지단니기 계시시는데 당봉아 세기로와 랑이 친이 주빈 나라미니 나오 냠바지 괜히 나이 세니 나이 롱치 잡아서 못한 거로와 어디 제인데 아니 다 자손이 뭐바 강가 랑주기다 나랑주기다 디두 강가 대와다 중요한 넘바나 조용히 두강가 자손이 뭐바 강가 나랑 수수주기 아니 지다 오다 되게 직다 주체 시당디 나라미네 나오 냠도 되는 랑게 친이 주봤음 바다 나이발라미네 나이 롱제자르 짐밤 마티니 텔라 롱제보 버짐 바 소다 티니니기 고네 아니 마진 직다당 나이와 짐바 직다니기 남발라 민다와데 가스나 치기 나kho라 랑게 친이 주비 나오 냠도 짐바치 치기 아니 나이위 세시들라 미네 아니 나티니 테라 롱체버보스 나오 왔다 두치도 군니가 강사랑게 친이 주바진 바 찍바체 지금 이나양 진주다 미타와데 어디래 나이요 세다 아니 나이 롱체자 세니가 왔다 되게 제발니 직단이 제발도 두치니 나 군니한 진당라 미타와 비유스는 지금 말 진당 찍바래 가서 군니가 강사 당신이 찍바래 이나양 강사 나도 진당들아 미라와 제발 오다 진루 진당디 직 풍보라 나라미네 다 아니 나오님도 야 하는 친이 좀 같은 바치 아 나진 나이와 좀 지다 되기 나이 위치시 미나솔라 미네 나이 롱체자오 님 야나 나디니 나이 미나솔라 롱체바부 신드랑이 친이 좀 같은 바다 어떤데 지금 우리도 신이 제바샤우도 어디
Okay, so in the English text, we're on page 215. Let's see. I'm gonna take a second just because the paragraph in the Tibetan is where we started is in the middle of a long paragraph, so I just have to match it up where we are. In base. Sorry. Bye.
지dan 얘기 제바시바 카돌
Geshe.
가슴디 주제래
Yeah. Geshe diola ra. Okay, so I'll just read this whole paragraph and it will contain what was read by Geshe. Thus, Chandakirti says that you eliminate. Oh, so it's page 214 on the bottom there. Thus, Chandakirti says that you eliminate the view of the perishing aggregates by knowing the selflessness, the non-intrinsic existence of the self that is the object of observation, thereby contradicting the way that it is apprehended by the view of the perishing aggregates. Hence, the view of the perishing aggregates must apprehend the opposite of that wisdom which knows selflessness. Moreover, since the view of the perishing aggregates is a conception of the person as essentially existent, it is a conception of an I that exists by way of its intrinsic character. Using this as an example, you should be able to understand the view of the perishing aggregates that is a conception of mine. Even when they do not conceive I or mine, conceptions of the person as substantially existent are still cases of ignorance that misconceives the self of persons. So uh, it is not the case that they are not afflictions. Okay, so here the main point is distinguishing between these two types of view of the perishing aggregates. So there are two types of view of the perishing aggregates because there's one that is grasping, is the I grasping, and one that is the mind grasping, M-I-N-E, mind grasping, view of the perishing aggregates. So they both are instances of view of the perishing aggregates, and they both are cases of self-grasping of persons where they are grasping the self to be established by way of its own characteristics. And so they both have that same cognitive appraisal or the same way of cognizing their object, but they are a little different in that the I grasping, the view of the perishing aggregates, which just looks at the I, is taking as its main object the conventionally existent I. There's this I which conventionally exists, and it takes that and it holds that to be, or cognizes that to be, established by way of its own characteristic. But the mind grasping, then instead it takes the sort of objects experienced by or utilized by the eye, and then taking those, so like the eyes and ears and so forth, the different things used by the eye, and then it takes those and apprehends them as being the experiencer, and then through that sense of being the experiencer grasps the experiencer as established by way of its own characteristics. Okay, so that's the difference between those two, and but it's still related. They're both looking at something which is in the continuum of the person itself, the person who is grasping themselves to be established by its own characteristic. They're both something within the continuum of that person or yourself, the I or the mind. And so, but there's this slight difference in their way of apprehending, one apprehending as an I and the other apprehending as mine. Apprehending, or you could say cognizing as I or cognizing as mine. And so basically the simple thought of, of this is me or I. So you're taking that thought of I and then grasping it as being existent, established by way of its own character is the I grasping view of the perishing aggregates. But then and then for the grasping mind view of the perishing aggregates, there's two slightly different ways it can happen. One is, or ways that it works. One is, so taking the things experienced and utilized by the I, by me, by I, and then taking them, apprehending them as the objects of experienced by me, and thus they're mine, and then grasping that mine to be established by way of its own characteristic. Or it could also be grasping them as the experiencer, so that either as the objects experienced or as the experiencer, and utilizer, and then grasping as though established by way of its own character. So either of these or both of these, they are the sort of basis of all our suffering, all the various types of afflictions that we generate, and the various suffering that arises from that. They are the basis of these. And so but we have to say that the actual way that they apprehend these two different kinds of self-grasping ignorance, they both apprehend their object. They have the same style of apprehension or the same cognitive appraisal. It's just a slight difference in how one is taking the they're both grasping at the self of persons. They're both grasping at a self of persons, but one is grasping itself of this I, grasping the self of persons, and one is mine, grasping the self of persons.
Oh yeah. 어두신다 다티 어디라 나당 아이오 님도 미진비 강사 제수요바 진바니 강사게 다도 몽베 마리바 임베 유몽 마임바 미주로 오스다 아 직다든다 빼나 나당 아이와 랑이 신이 주바 진바들 직다셰와 다티 마임베와 나당 아이 마진 직다당 아이위 진데기 남바 마창게와 강사 나 제수요바 진바 점 딘데디야 아니 가스나 지가지레 강사 다도 몽바인 베 뉴몬제 뉴몬 많이 봐 미주르 세연되게 다 가스나 뉴몬게 진다 아니 자와 지경기 지다 강사 당신이 또 지다 디샤로 와다 지다 딜레 셴비 아니 강사랑게 친이 주바 진바함 야나 강사 제소요 봐 진바 주조야 아니 지 강사라 몽 친지로도 강사라 친지로도 슈비로 인상 아니 가리레 뉴모징 마리바 샤워레스 다 뉴모징 마리바이나 이지미지 나다 나이 친신 나이발라 미네 랑게 친이 주바 진바지 고 마레스 나 제수 요바 진바 제수 세티 랑자 투바 풍볼라 마드비 아니 제수 요바 풍볼라 마드비 랑자 바 진바 틴데비 지수디양 아니 강사라 친지로도 슈비 아니 뉴모바이 이자 아니 뉴모마이 바 두 마레 신시엔데 다 지단니디 세가드 다 가진 도바주소와 가스나 나랑이 친이 주바 진바디 강사 당진이나 아니 규신라 랑 규타디비 강사라 미네 랑이 친이 주바 진바디양 아니 직다 차기도 아니 직다 데니 직다라 데니 랑규기 나라 미바지 간여 고레 나라 미바 가서 도바질레서와 오다 도바디기 내기다 최승정시 자고 어디 그와 무슨이 맞다 nga rangi tsini tuba zimba tsamla jikta siki maare jikta ina rangyugi nga da nga yewa khanula mine ane rangi tsini tuba zimba singdang di da dinda di kapsu shene arwa nga ane kasana rangi tsini tubi nga o nyamba zimba tang ane rangi tsini tubi nga di rangi mina sola longo chobabo yin sami zimba nisha wan zinsu di wando chini ane nyumung shea chidang tindregi zindang me jang kangsa rangja tubi zesu yuwa zimba diyang nimonji ki dini kansa ki dini kansa la lo chinjiru do shibu nimonji re soda di dungu tusu kya dungu su
So just repeating the last small paragraph, using this as an example. Oh, wait, that wasn't it. So top of page 115, even when they do not conceive I or mine, conceptions of the person as substantially existent are still cases of ignorance that misconceives a self of persons. So it is not the case that they are not afflictions. So we had these two different kinds of view of the perishing aggregates, one which is grasping I and one which is grasping as mine. But something else can be a self-grasping of persons, which is neither of those two. So in general, just grasping a person as being established as self, just the merely mind grasping a person as being established as self. And so the the sort of miscognition or the misperception, which is they view the perishing aggregates. Well, so what is that again looking at? Well, is taking the I or mine and then looking at the those as being established by way of their own character. But you can have a different basis for your miscognition, your miscognizer there, which but still be grasping that as established as a substantially existent person. And so that, again, with the view of the perishing aggregates, it's looking at the person within your own continuum. So it has to be a basis of generating the thought I or me, or me as the, or even if not I or me, then the experiencer, the user of my of mine, the user and experiencer of mine. So, but then you could also have just any person looking at a different person as well, who is not in your continuum and grasping them as being substantially existent, and that is also a self-grasping of persons. So Tsongkhapa first went through these two different kinds of view of the perishing aggregates and made it very clear, explained them very clearly, and showed how this is the person, the I or me within one's own continuum, and how the mind takes that as the main focal object, the main object of observation, and explained, well, how does it grasp its object? How does the view of the perishing aggregates grasp that I or mine in my own continuum? And explained all that. But then you can have the doubt, well, what about a mind which grasps a person as being established, substantially existent, which is not looking at or observing a self in your own continuum or your own I or mine? Well, now he's saying, clarifying, we're not saying that those are not afflictions. That's also an affliction. That's also a case of the self-grasping of persons, even though it's not considered the view of the perishing aggregates. So it's looking at any person. So even if it's not one of those two kinds of view of the perishing aggregates, any mind which is observing any person and then grasping them to exist or cognizing them to exist as established from their own characteristics. That is an affliction, and it's grasping it at the self of persons. So.
Yeah, 대단한 랑경고 주비 랑신 잠라 다도 샤바당 나오 냠바 잠기 로유도 다도 제바 니레스 당본이 리비 가자 일라 치만이 탄예도 되고 미고고 스타 다딜라디니 가스나 땅아오 냠비 로디라 로니샤 로 친지 로지당 로 튼튼니샤 다로 친지로 어떻게 가리래 랑기 친지 주비 나오 냠비 징이 로 친지로 대차와 단 풍보라 답이 나점만 미니 나오 냐마디 로 튼튼히 차와 다이 가서는 로 튼튼히 임바디 풍보라 답이 나점 디니 강사르와 나르와 베나랑주 nga se ge ta pen so nga se lo ke dang de la ani lo ke dang mi da wa ni sha ni wa ta nga rang zu mang che wa ta ke de ta lo chi ji lo rang ge chi ni ju de nga di shi je ge tong ni nga wo nyam go chi dang ang du che wa ina pu bo la ta be rang ju la ni nga rang zu ju la nga ji ro nga su kang sa ta nga se da kang sa se da ki bu se da tun da chi sha wo wa o di chi de kang sa si na yang pu bo la ta be nga zam de la su go re 기부스네 풍골 답이 나좀 나스네 풍골 답이 나좀 다 디지도 오 풍골 답이 나좀 딜라 나오 냠도 징행기 뭐 튼튼하게 지더라 샤핑 나지당 아로 똑베 따좀 많이 비더니 툼만 비들은 주비 아니 주바들라 되니 나샤니 오 지지미 지바들라 아니 나진 지다 힌지기 지더라 샤핑 나 세우다 티레 오다 틴저와디 아니 가리레 갑디 시에기 각자 지바르와 지 담메도 비셔라고 싶이 각자 디레스 모두 지기 노원념이 유 후보라 답이 나좀 지어와 딜이 어 딘데베 나디 아니 가스나 갑디 지비 각자디 말에 세두다 나디라 니레서와 탄예도 유비 나지당 아니 이게 같이 나니샤 같이 나디 가리레 랑기 친유 주비 나디 와 랑기 친유 주비 나 세두 가리레 로는 민양 다유 좀 마인비 투문비 월로 민게 샤좀 마인비 투문 마인비 아니 두비 라왕 두바지 오티라 오니 다셔네 티진비로 여기 치다샤비 유디 아니 가리레 가리비 가자디체 단 풍볼라답이 나좀 저러 풍볼라답이 나좀 어디 탄예도 나디 디샤 오다 디진 진비로 치다샤비 탄예도다 들수드나 탄예도 나디 오고 말에 나진 지다기 신디니 가스나 치더라 샤핑 나디 오그레 세르다 미바디 까기 말에 지디 미바디라 미주 나디체 남비 덴디니 나디 아니 메주 나디 오다 티레 미바디 까기 말에 미남니 수지 미비 나디 지다 세디 나라미네 랑이 신이 주바진바 세디 나디 탄예도 나라차 코 랑이 신이 주바진이 되더니 랑이 신이 주바디 아니 남비 나디제 그래서다 남비 나디 아니 같이 다들이 미비 나디 아니 같이 다 말이 세기 십자 지당 아니 가스나 나디라 니샤네와 탄예도 유비 나지당 같이 나니샤 같이 나디더니 가리래 어디 로 민대 샤자 마이비 라왕 주비 아니 tindibi rawang mun duba chi shani oda tindewadila ani yo mares ani kasna phungbola tabe ngazamdi yore oda tinini shani ripi gaja kapti ripi gaja di na kasna ngao nyebe lo yinze ki gaja di kagwa mares gaja sa ngao nyebe lo yinze gangagi yudi kagwa mares wa lo chube jodani mingden shazam mahimbe tumomabi zinzu 다든산이 여바 징행기 로디기 샤빙아디 니 가고리 소다탄가 메세 다디 티샤 다 양가 유 단년도 유스디니 풍보를 답이 나점 오다 티유스 그래서는다 이도와 당부 리비 가자 일라 치마니 단년도 되고 미고고 세디 치마디 단년도 유비 나디시 당부디 아니 가스나 나진 직대기 지더라 진비 진단기 유디라 아니 나시비때 어디 아니 리바야 되게 가자 디레 와 다음에도 비시라고 준비 가자 디레 그래서다 뭐 무슨 무슨
Okay, so next paragraph. As in the passage just cited, self refers to mere essential or intrinsic existence, and also refers to the object of an awareness that simply thinks I. Of these two, the former is the object negated by reason, whereas the latter is accepted conventionally, so it is not refuted. Therefore, this passage indicates that you do not refute the object which is observed by the innate view of the perishing aggregates. However, the way that its aspect is apprehended is as an essentially existent I. So it is not that you do not refute that way of apprehending. So there are what is being clarified here is that there are actually two different types of mind which think I or me. So just the thought of I, the thought of me. One of them is a miscognizer, or a mind which apprehends its object in a distorted way. Okay. However, the other one is a mind which is accordant with reality. In other words, an accurate mind cognizing its object accurately. So there are two kinds of minds that think me. Okay, so which is the one which is thinking or cognizing in a distorted way, the miscognizer? So that's the one that takes I as its focal object, what it's observing, and then grasps it and cognizes it to be established by way of its own characteristics. But then when we just think, just generally, talking about I, me, just as in general, just thinking of I or me, or talking of I or me, then there's really just again, there's two different ways of having that kind of mind arise. When we speak of I or think of I, there are two different ways for that kind of mind to arise. So most commonly, it is this distorted kind of mind. That's the most common mind that thinks of I when it arises in our continuum, in our minds. But then we have there's different synonyms for I. So we can say I, me, person, a being. Again, in this case, the person in one's own continuum, one's own person, or one's own being, the being in one's own continuum. Being as in living being, not the being meaning just a living being. And so that living being, that person or I, that's the I which is a mere I that is designated in dependence upon the aggregates. Okay, so this kind of I, and when we're having the thought of I and this mere I which is designated upon the aggregates, that is not the I that is being negated in this context, when we're negating the apprehended object of the view of the perishing aggregates. So that I is the I which conventionally exists. But then when we have a kind of cognition or a mind which is cognizing an I that is not dependent upon the aggregates, but instead is established by way of its own power, by established independently, and we're cognizing that kind of I, then that is, again, that kind of mind is the distorted one, the one that's holding the I in a distorted way, or miscognizing it. So there is an I which exists conventionally. There are two kinds of I's then we're talking about. One which does exist conventionally and is just the object of the mere I, an object of the thought that takes a mere I designated in dependence on the aggregates. That I conventionally exists. But if we have a mind which is cognizing, an I which is not dependent on terms and labels, not dependent on names, being merely posited by names, and instead is established by way of its own entity, or by way of its own nature, or independently. And then that mind, grasps that I, is grasping in that way at the I, then the object of that mind, that's the one that we are negating here. That's the one the object that is to be negated. So what we're saying here is that the observed object of the view of the perishing aggregates, that's not being negated. It's not the observed object, but this is something that is a characteristic in Buddhist psychology, something which I should say something which is explained in a general sense in Buddhist psychology, and here it becomes very relevant, which is a difference in any given minds, between the object of observation and then to use the term that we just read in this paragraph, it is the aspect that's apprehended. So here the sentence says the way that its aspect is apprehended. So it doesn't really like lay it out so clearly in this paragraph that there's a difference between these two for any given mind. So it says in the first one sentence, therefore this passage indicates that you do not refute the object which is observed. So we should really be looking at that as like a technical term, the object which is observed by the innate view of the perishing aggregates. However, the way that its, and this is like another technical term, aspect is apprehended is an essentially existent I. So those are, so anyway, the distinction here is between the object that's observed and then the aspect that's apprehended. Okay, so those are, in general, in Buddhist psychology, those are explained and understood, but here it becomes very important because we're saying the object of negation, the object to be negated, it's not the view of the perishing aggregates object observed, but it's the aspect that's apprehended, or you could say the cognitive appraisal. It's another way to say that. So, so the mere I, just the mere I designated upon the aggregates, is conventionally existent, and that's the object observed by the view of the perishing aggregates, the I and mine. So we could say the I, which is when we're talking about the view of the perishing aggregates, there's the I that's observed, and then the I that's apprehended. We can make that distinction. And so the I that's apprehended is to be negated. The I that's observed is not to be negated. That exists. So then again, we're saying that in general, for whatever kind of mental cognition, whatever any kind of mind which thinks I or me, if we ask, are all of them objects to be negated? No, not every single one of them is an object to be negated. So we have the conventionally existent I, which is the I that is merely designated upon the five aggregates, merely designated upon the aggregates. So that I exists, but then the I, which is the aspect that's apprehended by the view of the perishing aggregates, that is the I that is to be that is to be negated. That doesn't exist. So.
ngao nyamba tsam ki lu yu du da do che ba ni le s ngao nyamsa ki ro nga ji ro wa ta di ngao nyamsa ki di ga ri re ta nga ran zu pe na ran zu la pa ta nga zu ne na sa ji yong an nga na gi du se je ro nga di kan je ju yo ro pe na nga la kang yen ro ji pe na su su la kang yen ji chung wa yin na ani nga se ji yang su su la pe thun da chim bu ju jung ni 아니 배 가수를 쉬우지 내는데 아 세지 성질리고 어떤 팀들에 나세 강사디 무의 순간들라 뭔가 선집이 죽다 시나니다 무의 순간 민자와 소소소 시작거리스 배나 아 제람 지나가서님아 지르다 빌라래 나 제람마와이나 아니 가서 배나 아나 세가디 아니 풍보디 말하샤니 디 아니 지 가르렸으나 아 풍보라 아니 나이 다니시니 나우 녀메디 풍보라 체박이 싶으니 나샤고 그래스 와 제라마에 다 도데베나 풍보 좀 많이 받지 풍부 유인들라 와 풍부 유인들라 나샤니 띵 나우 세게 섬당서 나디 티니지샤고 그래스 가사들와 다 심잠발라드니 니샤지 비전하게 심잠바단 루미전하게 심잠바스 니시고와 다 안나 비전하게 심잠바이나 이기 나바셰바딜라 나 신이더니 나오 냠비 랑주기더니 이게 넘바셰바들라 나오 냠니 냠메기 나디 이게 넘바셰바디 자고리스 다 룽기 저랑에 심잠바이나 많이 가서나 군신 넘바셰바 와 군신 넘바셰바들라 나오 냠메 나디 아니 군신 넘바셰바디 자고리스 와 어두시 다 우마랑 주발라 민다와 니신들 와 로벨린 덴지기더니 마 제랑이 도대주고 우마랑 주바당 안로베 시속이 되는 전화기 넣어주고 말한 주비 강사게양 나오 녀메 강사디 무유수나 미다와 니신 로벨린데 지금 전화도 제바이나 아니 가스나 나오 생가디 아니 가리리 이기 나바시바 짬라 아니 샤야디 이게 나바 셰바디 아니 겨왕가만 디르는 디네 치마도 나오 님이 나디 디샤고레스 다 로베 시바소다 로베 와 승기사보다 권한 쪽에 마 시베게 되는 나디 아니 이게 나바 셰바 주부 많이 봐지 이게 나바 셰비 유인디라 와 이게 나바 셰비 유인디라 아니 나오 님이 나디 디샤고레스 우마 탄규바르와 보물루도 빠낸 다와 잡아다와 로베 산예장 로베 파발라 군나주고 공과 시야 제가이나 디 풍볼라더니 나 샤에 나디 디고 말레스 디샤나더니 교연단의 풍부 아니 가리래 풍부 망부 요와나시 나디 망부 요국에 안 풍부디 아니 제와 디 샤와나시 나디 제요 샤국에 딘데기다 도르수드나 나스디 풍볼라 떼네 와 풍볼라 떼네 따점기 풍볼라 떼네 따점기 딘데기 저와 준유지라 소다 디 아니 가스나 뭐든 반에 다와 잡아도 로베 산지야 권나쪽에 투모만 입고 우마 탄주비 있네 실수 투모만 입어 나디 오다 풍볼라 떼네 가스나 나오 있으니 삼무당인데 안 풍본 로라 샤비 띵네 나오 냠고와 베나랑서 락바지 나와 있는 안나수 세저와 땅바지 나와 있는 안나수 쓰고 이나야 락바다 강바도 가 말아와 와 락바데 가 말이 강바데 가 말이 인도산이 가서는 나오 세계 풍부기 체벌도 집에 있기 때문에 아니 나오 예비 딘데 로케완상 나 세디 풍보라 때네 따zam기 아니 딘데 왜니 자와 주니지 샤고레스 어디 강사 샤야디 아니 갑디 지다 참무기로와 땅랑 랑기 친니주바 증에게 지다지어와 어디 지다 참무기 미비 나디 어디 풍보라 때네 따zam기 나디 샤고레스 와 어디 티찬에더니 딘데 나디 아니 나오 냐미 시지고 다 탄니도 나 세우다 딩외수 거레스 어떻습니다.
So we'll just stay on this paragraph, but just to clarify a little bit more. So we have the mere thought of I, the mere thought of me. So what is the thing that this thought is thinking of? What is the I that this thought is thinking of? What is that? Where is that mind? What's the basis of that thought of that kind of thought, that kind of mind? So let's look at, for instance, we can have some pain in our arm, and we say, "Oh, my arm hurts. My arm, my arm hurts." And so we have this basic, idea that there's an I here who has pain and suffering, and then we have some kind of problems come, like sickness and other problems, or we have some kind of important work, some kind of important something important in our life, something that's important for us to do or accomplish, something happening. And so there's the I, the person, the I or me that we think of when something like that happens, when we have some suffering or something important is happening. We think, I have to do this, I am suffering, I am sick. So what is the I? That's the basis of those kinds of thoughts. So there's actually 4 different ways, or more than 4 different ways of positing that, but each of the different tenet systems or Buddhist paradigms of philosophy, they each have a different way of thinking of this and positing it. So for the first school, it's called the 5 Bhashika. Okay, so for them, it's just the 5 aggregates. The collection of the 5 aggregates are the 5 aggregates, which they posit as the person or I. For the Sautrantika, the sutra followers, then they look at the continuum of the aggregates and posit that to be the I, the continuum of the aggregates. Okay, for the Chittamatra or mind only, there are 2 sub-schools there. And so the first one is those who follow reason, and the second is those who follow scripture. So the Chittamatras who follow reason, they posit the mental consciousness as the I. For the Chittamatra Chittamatras who follow scripture, they posit the alaya vijnana, the storehouse consciousness. Then we have also within the Svatantrika Madhyamaka, the autonomy middle way school, they have 2 sub schools, and so there are those who for like followers of or the style of philosophy from Lobenlegten J, who is I'm not remembering his Indian name right now, but Lobenlegten J. So yeah, it's not coming to my mind, but anyway, he for that school, that sub school, then it's it's also the mental consciousness, which the mere mental consciousness, which goes from the former life to the later life. And then the sub school of the autonomy middle way, which is the followers of Shantarakshita and Haribhadra and so forth, they posit the continuum of the mental consciousness, continuity of the mental consciousness. So then we have the Prasangika Madhyamaka, the consequence middle way school. So those people like Buddha Palita and Chandakirti, etc. Okay, so they are the ones who have this unique position of positing the mere I, which is merely designated upon the aggregates. And so they look and say, like, well, what's the problem if you posit the 5 aggregates as the person? Well, just like you have, if you have 5 aggregates and you say the person is the 5 aggregates, then the I would become 5-fold. There would be 5 I's, right? So they use like this kind of reasoning, and so they, they are able to refute some of the other ideas about the I, and so then they're left with the I is the mere I that's designated independence upon the 5 aggregates. So then when we have some pain or we have some pain in our arms or in our legs hurt, our arms hurt, our hands hurt, and we say, oh, my hands hurt, my legs hurt, well, I'm in pain, I'm sick, that we have that I'm in pain, I'm sick. Well, again, the hands and the arms or the legs, those aren't the I, but so then the I that's sick, even though it's an dependence on the arm hurting, that we say I'm hurting, I'm in pain, but the hand or the arm is not I, but it's the I which is designated in dependence upon the aggregates. It's the I which does various actions, the I which is an agent, or it does actions. So this is it. When we're in this context, looking at the Prasangika view, we're looking at really the subtlest form of the view of the perishing aggregates. And with the subtle view of the perishing aggregates, and it is, and we make this distinction between the aspect that's apprehended versus the object that's observed. Well, the object that's observed is this conventionally existent I. So
어두시 다 디니 지달 현재기 미과 미고가 뛴기스 남비 진당니스 랑기 고 주베 나 임베스 팀 미고바 민데스 페나 자당징기 미과 나자 미고 장스 디슈 자다바 고바 미가와 신무스 다든데 디가스로와 다 담메 또 비셔라기로와 담메 또 비셔라기 담메 세게로와 담메 세게 다 당징기 다 가리 지달 수 유디 매바 와 당징 지다 되게 지달 수 유디 매바 세게 시인데 다 딘데베 당징 지다 되게 지달 수 유디라 니샤 미과 당 남바 니샤 미유 당 진다 시유 니샤 와다 미유기 다디 가고 말에 디 단위도 유비 나들와 나 랑싱 주바 지바 지다와 랑주이 나라 미네 랑시 주바 지바스 랑주이 나디 단위도 유비 나 티가고 말이스 코 랑싱 주바디 까는 되더니 다가스 다도 디샤고레스 페나 가리레 다 미다바토비 셰랍데라 때네 다 당진 K 시도 다 딱바 짐비 당진기 뉴 다디 까고 말이스 넘버 다 딱바 디까기도 와스 오페 디나시 제네드니 다음에 또 비셰랍기 지다 마리베 시유디 까 시디 디니 미규디 다디 마가와체 디 남비 다디 까고레 신두잔다 미유 다디 유주 다디체 남비 다디 미주다 와다 오 디기 제바체 베디 다기 미다바 다 미다바도 비셰라라 때네 아니 다 당진기 시유까기리 모두지 미유까기 말이 시디 다타바즈미 당진기 미유디 다르와 다디 까고 말와 다 딱바디 까기도 와 원자 오디 다타바디 까는디 남바디 까스 와 다타바즈미 당진기 남비 유디 까기리 안네 미비 유디 까기 말이스 오 벤티나시 전에 아니 담에도 비셔라기 당진 hin지기 지달 수 유까스 유디 미유디 말이스 남바디 까고 말이스 어떻게 아니 디시에도 다 까디 오늘 다가 세다 당의 중월에 세계 가지 다디 아니 남비 다들 샤고레스 어디 집저셔
So next paragraph, just on page 215. Oh, actually, we're in the middle of the paragraph. Okay, so we're starting with the we'll read one sentence with however that we read before. However, the way that its aspect is apprehended is an essentially existent I, so it is not that you do not refute that way of apprehending. For example, you do not refute the sound that is the object observed by a conception that sound is permanent, but you do refute the permanent sound that is the referent object of that conception. It is not a contradiction. This case is similar. So this is giving an example where, first we'll talk about, so the wisdom which realizes selflessness is negating a self, right? It's taking the way in which the mind, self-grasping ignorance apprehends or cognizes its object. It's negating whatever, whatever way it's that apprehended object is, that's what's being negated by the wisdom which knows selflessness and realizes selflessness. So then again, we have to make this distinction between the object observed and the, as it says here, now another term comes, the conceived object, or actually, sorry, referent object. Sometimes it's translated as conceived object. And now here it says referent object. So there's a distinction between the observed object and the referent object. So the observed object is not being negated and refuted. So let's take an example then, like the wisdom which knows that sound is impermanent. Wisdom realizing that sound is impermanent. So here it is not, it is refuting the permanence of sound, but it is not negating sound, not refuting sound. And so the object which is the observed object, the observed object, that is the right, so the observed self is not refuted, but the reference self, using some terms that are equivalent here. So just to clarify, so the referent object, or the, I said conceived object, but in the previous section, it was called then the aspect that's apprehended. So these all are referring now to the same thing, okay? So referent object or aspect that's apprehended are the same thing. So the observed self is not refuted, but the aspect of apprehension self is refuted, or you could say the referent object self is refuted. Again, of the view of the perishing aggregates here, right? So the view of the perishing aggregates has both an observed object I and a referent object I, or an aspect apprehended I. The aspect apprehended I is refuted. The observed I is not refuted. So this again is made more clear by looking at the example of, again, this maybe just as a note for the translator's note, this is clear in the context of if you've studied general Buddhist logic, this talking about sound, realizing sound to be impermanent and refuting sound to be permanent is an extremely common topic that comes up repeatedly over and over in typical, in the standard Buddhist logic courses. Okay, so then using the example of refuting sound's permanence, so if you have the mind which is cognizing sound is permanent, and you when you refute that object, you're refuting permanent sound, but you're not refuting sound. So it's similar to the view of the perishing aggregates, because you have two different objects. The permanent sound is the aspect apprehended of that mind, but it is not the observed object. Sound is the observed object, just sound itself. So likewise, we can say the aspect that's apprehended I, and then the observed object I. So when we're looking at the object to be negated, then we have to posit the aspect that's apprehended I. Yeah, that's all.
Oh yeah. 대단한 파바 얍세다 루베니기 슈네 랑싱기 요나 랑기 모요나 랑기 친이기 요나스 제수요나 시에 가바 숭비 랑싱라 소바 아니 생활 때바 대다도 리바 잘라스 대다메바 뜸비 칭남기스 원 퇴양 마리베 신바달기 퇴메바 뜸바 대다로 코와 차우스다 다 주동 점들와 다든다 딘데스 다 가자데 무슨게 다 니마도 스마 제시모고지 토니다 다 타돔 잡이는데 다 파바 얍세스도 다 공부르다 로빈 파발라 공부르도 슈다 자와시라라 소바다 리소투 아니 로빈 파발라기 슈다 시자발라 소바 다나신 로빈니스 로빈 산지쟁기더니 로와 개바 부다팔리다 앞로빈 빠데다와 잡아기로 오마 치세다 주바 랑제라 소바니 다 랑신 카브레 랑신 요나 드니 교육인들이 요르세다 카브레 랑고 요나 신이한 딘데 카브레 랑게 친이기 요나 제수 요나 오다 딘데게 타니 미다와 송 그리스네 누가가 아니 전다 직바 밥사지 찍으랬어 와 랑신기 요바당 랑고 요바다 랑게 친이기 요바 제수 요바 세디 가전네 지레스 가전네 지가스나 나를 콘도 때마다서 이게 시잡이 나나 가리래 다지 자와니 강신 후보는 미실라 라말리베랑시데 테메반 다메바우 스니다 시잡이 때와는 반에 다와서 송도 와 인도선이 가리래 다 세디 아니 민데 샤잠 와 민데 샤발라 마드베 유랑게 둘루문이 두바직 오다 유나 아니 다라 두레 오다 랑신 두나 딘데식 아니 진이 두나 딘데식 제수 두나 딘데식 오다 딘데식이 다 갑디 가지 다디 랑 타니 만도 민민다 뭐고 요르데 이는 내직이 다디 똑베 따서 마인비 여바지 와 똑베 따서 마인비 여바지라 가자샤니 오다 티 라티니 랑싱이 유나 세게란데 가자당 랑이 친이 여바스 제수 여바스 오든수 강가 내직 바레스 오다 티 무수네 아니 이와 담에 곰세데 담에 뜨세 담에 세게제 신윤데 오다 민데 샤자 마인비 여바지 디 와민데 샤 최담제 민데 샤잠레 아르와 민다 데 샤잠 임발라 아니 디 마이 샤잠 마이비 유랑 유즈지요나 다된제니 유즈 오다 디 유즈디 민두 삼네 오다 딜라 녜바테니 오다 디 짐빌로디 로 친지로 레샤 삼네와 마리바 심바 따르기 세도다 랑조타 수수수 귤라르와 차소니모바 강가 폐기 建디 아니 미데 샤자 마인비 여바디 숭와라 때네 아니 틴데지 용도 오다 틴데 민데 샤자 마이 비여바디 진비 로디 마리바 레샤 삼미 오다 디 무주 치비 고네 아니 팀메바디 라티니 고아께 탑시 지고래 고아 좌우 씁니다 지름지 주동 자연데 다 인다 디가수다 sabjidi karire gaja nguyusuwe kapwa iza gaja nguyusuwe kapsu ani gaji namdang mindawa mangboji yoride tunda dodo tunda dire mikde shaza mayimba minjang tayo za mayimbi yobaji chuna ani gaja le madebare oti zimbilodi maribare ani chaso nimoba ganga yongwe kiendire oda tim mebi tyonde hakuwe goni ani teta ani 요마리 세 밀루메단디 아니 셰바 치비고네 되니 하고와 치고레스 보다 돈도 디디가 하는 거스
So now there's a conclusion of this section by Tsongkhapa. The noble father Nagarjuna, his spiritual son Aryadeva, and the two masters Buddhapalita and Chantakirti preface their refutations by saying, if things existed intrinsically, if things existed essentially, if things existed by way of their own intrinsic character, and if things existed substantially, you should understand that the intrinsic nature and so forth mentioned in those texts is as indicated above. Also, you should understand that the words indicating that those various things do not exist mean that they do not exist as they are conceived by ignorance. So then this is the conclusion of identifying the object to be negated and looking at the text of these great scholars and Niyamika masters of Nagarjuna, Aryadeva, Buddhapalita, Chandrakirti. So looking at the fundamental treatise on wisdom and looking at the 400 verses and looking at the commentaries by Buddhapalita, as well as the clear words of Chandrakirti and the entering the middle way and the commentary in the 400 stanzas, all these texts which we've been quoting from the Elimination of Refutations by Nagarjuna. So they use these different phrasings in saying, if things existed by way of their own nature, from their own nature, if things existed intrinsically, if things existed essentially, if things existed by way of their own character, or characters, you can say by way of their own characteristic. Here it's just intrinsic character. So we're adding even more synonyms in the English as anyway. So yeah, so we have these different ways of saying things, saying this, but they all come down to the same point. It's the same essential fact, the same very, very important point that they come down to, which is this is the object to be negated. So their meaning comes to the same thing. And again, the commentary in the 400 verses by Chandrakirti actually stated it in the most clear way, which was again quoted above on page 213, where there's a quote on the towards the bottom of that page. Self is an essence of things that does not depend on others. It is an intrinsic nature. The non-existence of that is selflessness. Okay, so that was the kind of clearest way of stating this, but they all these phrasings refer to that. Okay, and so then again, it's what is it? It's this, it's this grasping. It's the sense of, you know, an object being established from its own nature within the object itself, or an object established with a substance, substantially, an object established with its own essence, okay, essentially, or with its own essence. And so another way of saying that is to exist by without being something which is existent without being existent by being merely designated by conception. So I don't know, the negation is, to say it slowly again. So something which is not existent merely by being designated by conception or conceptual mind. So that's the object to be negated. That's all of them come to that same essential point, that this is the object to be negated. So then Tsongkhapa is saying in the kind of very last sentence in this paragraph, you should understand that the second to last sentence, you should understand that the intrinsic nature and so forth mentioned in those texts is as indicated above. So he's really saying this is now our job to do, our work to do, that we have to take all of these different phrasings and ways of identifying or pointing out the object to be negated, and then in our own minds, actually make that identification, identify that object to be negated, and then meditate on selflessness. Meditate on how it does not exist, the way in which it does not exist. And again, what is it to say that things don't exist intrinsically? Well, we're looking at the kinds of minds which are apprehending or cognizing objects as though they exist, as though it's an object that is not merely designated by terms and names, not merely designated by language. And so some mind which apprehends something to exist like that, that's ignorance. That is the ignorance. That ignorance is the source of attachment, anger, delusion, and all the afflictions. That's the ignorance. That is the source of all the afflictions. And so any mind that grasps things to exist in that way is ignorance. And then that is important for us to understand, that we have to understand, Tsongkhapa is saying, and then we can meditate and learn and understand how the object of those minds does not exist. That there does not exist an object which is not merely designated by language and words and terminology. So
그것도 다든다 디 subject 가자 응외수 응외디 subject 조아레스 다디 낭된디 한자 마치 자시치니 지와이나 다디 낭된 조디 다 가자 응외수와 스리다 돈유도 그비 가자디 응외수에디다 다 돈유도 동관이 세데 당면 세게다 공바 제발라 강미규 다디다 동관이 세데 강동에게 가자디 왜 마세와 다 돈이 고면 하는 게 말이에요. 인도전에 다 가장 외수한테 다 돈이 고면이 남 당부디. 그러나 돈이 고면인데 되니 가지래. 내시고는 공세대 가장이 비내스 당부도 두도 와서 다 인도전에 다 맞다 말한수다 이 낭된이 쫓아와래. 다 가자디 예비 내기가 나 모두 제사와. 디전에 다 돈이 공세대 아니 미아와 또베 따자 마인비 여바디 도움도 제대 뒤요 말이스. 와 최담제 또베 땅점 레스. 또베 마다비 유주지 요 말이 뒤요나 아니 장신 주발이 민두 소다 뒤 메바디. 와 또베 따자 마인비 여바디 민두 삼바디 다 네바 제디 오다 가장 뇌시바 세기로 와다 뒤에서 돈이 공바서 고메디 티제 가자디 또베 따자 마인비 여바디 아니 가자샤니 다뒤 또베 따자 마비 여바디 뭐 심발라 담보 또베 따자 디 하고 예바도 운도 저거리스 와 또베 따자 하마고 또베 따자기 마이 또베 따자 마비 여바 세들라 오다 팅마리스 제름지기로 와 아니지 정말 또베 따자 조수시세는 딜레 또베 당진기 조수 데라도 셰바 규베스 그러니 또베 따자기 남샤디 마당 가자디 무슨게지 신주 또베 따진데 제시딩이라 자요 우마고 말았으나와 어지름지 우미갑들와 디체인데 다 또베 따진 세디 최담제 또베 따진 세 이미 규정 하리래 가서는 최담제 dak시된도 제나 니에요 말스 베나 강사 세베나 강사당 최니 샤고로와 다 강사 세디 로 또베 파다좀 레스 계시 강사디니 아니 또베 따진 마인비 유주지요나 아니 강사기 다시딘도 제는 니주주거든요. 와 강사기 다시기 띵도 찌니요나 아니 강사기 다시 풍부하려 풍부도 들어와 다 풍부도 들으려니 아니 강사기 진시 니해지고 띵니에면도 띵상다 니와 명상 강사 세지 아니 다시 풍부라 따점기 ini ngaji la ani khansa sini ke ji shen de oda ti to be da zam se de lo to be par da zam wa bena xingda se de wa de ma zu mo zha se ji ku ji ke ji shen de o mo zha dang xingda ko lo se de zo gang ga ani lo to be par da zam ma do ji yu gi ting do dini che ga zhuwa ina ko ran gi xi ding do zena da xi ding zi nie yo ma ni zen da xi gi dini chok ba de la ani chawa chi ni wi ngo bo de la 아니 베나 모자이나 모자 쓴다에 강사이나 강사 쓴다에와 오 딘데지니 다오 딘데기디니 로또베 파다점기 인수디 삼모디 고안이라 자꾸 지내고와 다 또베 다점 인수디 삼모디 코나 아니 또베 다점 마인비디 여바디 민두 삼에기디니 디 또베 다점 마인비 여바지요나 아니 가자 차기도 쓰니와 오다 또베 다점 마인비 여바디라 다 또베 다점 마인비 유주지요나 아니 다든지 니주주고 다시 딘도와 다시 레딘도 디 제 베나 강사 세디나 강사게 풍부가 딘도 제와주나 강사니에요 말 에나 텔레 풍부를 마트비 강사 주요는 대야요 말스 와 강사 아니 가서나 강사 세디 풍부 딘도 요르데 이네 풍부 레제 강사게 세신이 봐 요르베스 디요 말스 아 디인도자니 다 강사 세니 게제시도 풍부 초점들라 아니 강사 세니 따와 와 다 딘데 도지기 로디양 로 추바지 따바르스는 디마리스 로 타니비 로 체마지기 다시 체마당 도지기 로데 체마이 바지 와 딘데지 모도지 양 똑베 따점 인세 강가 유빈이 바이 말 변나지 보라 세디 로 똑베 따점 탁바 타더딘도 주 똑베 따점 이네야 아니 다시 체마말 다시 체마디 많이 바디 가스나 콜 타니비 체면 누고 와 강사기 천시 아니 강사기 때문에 다시 풍부된도 아니 가지래 강사 스니 따바디라 아니 체메 네바면서 아니 다시 체마다 또 지기로데 체마 어다 디인도자니 로 체마 지기니 바다 점 세기가 최 탐제라 바 카페들와 당부 강사기 땡도 아니 다음이 나바시에도 강사기 다도 주나 안데제도 선무디가 선무 땅된데 기 카페니 아니 풍부된도 선무 땅 걔네들이 풍부를 심으더니 최 탐제도 선무 땅인데 아니 가자 선데 가자게 지내가 셔와디 다 돈이 또 남게 당부 개체쇼인 선 정연의 시민과 지름지 가장 위해서는 신도 가체고 선데 돈이 또 따와디 깨와라 가장 위해서 뭐지 휴진 내가 좀 디체인데다 틴데베틴다 디 sabject 낭도기 가자디 땅도 조사디 다선이네 돈이 또 따와디 가자 가리래 나는데 아니 리비 가자다 라미 가자니는 리비 가자데스 리비 가자데라 유이다 유진이는 유레스 유디야 가르스나 안 남도기 도다바 짬 마인비 단 남도 또베 따잠 마인비 유수지요나 아니 가자를 차와해 소다 디가나고 아니 고다 최투베 제디 sabject 낭도 쪼고 디샤스
So we'll go through this again as the conclusion of the section of identifying the object to be negated. When we say the object to be negated, it is the object of, we're talking about what is negated by the wisdom that realizes emptiness. So we have to identify what is that which is negated by the wisdom realizing emptiness. And so then we have the self, which does not exist. The thing which does not exist is the self. And so we have this meditation on meditating on emptiness by way of the four essential points. There's four, it's the kind of meditation. And so the first of those is identifying the object to be negated. So this is where we are, this is what we have gone through now. And so so we look at all phenomena, and for all phenomena, they are not found within their basis of designation. They are not established by way of their own nature. And so then what are they? They are they exist by being merely designated by conceptuality, but ignorance grasps all phenomena as though they exist without being mere designations of conceptuality. And so what does it mean then to say being merely designated by conceptuality? So first we have to, before we understand what it, this object of negation, right, existing without being, or existing as something that is not merely designated by conception. Then what does it mean to be merely designated by conception? So that is the first thing that we have to understand. We have to understand that. And so in the text by Tsongkhapa called the Umagombarapsa, or the illuminating the intent, then he actually goes through this at the beginning of the text in more detail. What does it mean to be merely designated by conception, conceptual thought? So you can say those are all also just interchangeable: conceptuality, conceptual thought, or conception. Concepts, maybe you could even say, although maybe not. So anyway, conceptual thought. You could also say conceptual mind. Okay, so all phenomena, they are not found within their basis of designation. So phenomena are not found within their basis of designation. But then we have, like, for instance, looking at a person. So the person is something which is merely labeled and designated by a mind over there, designated by a mind that is conceptual mind over there. And when you look within the basis of designation, then you don't find any I there. You'd have to be able to, if it existed without being posited, merely posited by conceptuality, you would have to find it within its basis of designation when you want to look for it. So also take other examples like a chariot, or simply a car. Then again, these are merely designated by the mind that is conceptual mind over there, and not found within the basis of designation. So they are things which, independence upon the basis of designation. There's a collection of there's a collection in the basis of designation that can do, various actions, that is able to do actions. But there's nothing found within the basis of designation when you go to look for it. So it has to be able, you would have to be able to find the designated object when you go to look for it. So there, when you look at the self again, back to the person or the self, then when you look one by one through each of the aggregates of a person, each of the, you could just say parts, even each of the parts of a person, or each of the aggregates of a person, one by one, you don't find, going one by one, you don't find the person. And you also don't find a person which is something completely apart from the aggregates or the parts of a person. And there's no, does not exist a person apart from the aggregates. But there does exist a person that exists independent upon the aggregates. You just don't find the person when you go and look in the basis of designation. You don't find the designated object. So when we're talking about the object, the basis of designation of some phenomenon, and the mind that is the conceptual mind labeling it over there on the basis of designation, then we're talking about reliable cognitions here. We're talking about valid and reliable cognitions, or Chenmo pramana. We're talking about pramana. So the basis of designation has to be validly, kind of a valid basis for an object to be designated, and the mind designating it, that conceptual mind, it has to be a pramana, or a reliable and valid mind. So not all labeling by conceptuality is labeling a phenomenon, is labeling or designating something that exists. So for instance, the horns of a rabbit, or a snake, uh, a snake on the basis of a striped rope. So you can have a mind that apprehends a snake where there's a striped rope, but that is not valid because when we just analyze just conventionally, we see that it is not true. It's not correct. It's negated by more correct perceptions or cognitions. So those things. So we're not saying that anything that is labeled by or designated by conceptuality is a phenomenon that exists. They have to be designated by prominent, correct perceptions and cognitions. So so then to be able to generate the view realizing emptiness, then it's extremely important to identify the object to be negated. And so seeing and then being able to understand, what is independence upon the what is the self that how to think about the self, which is exists independence upon the aggregates. So this is now again looking at the two. So what we went through in identifying the object to be negated. Again, it's extremely important to generate the view of emptiness. This is an essential thing to do, and identify the object to be negated. And when we kind of went through, starting from the top of the section, first we made a distinction. Tsongkhapa makes this distinction between the object negated by reasoning and then the object negated by path. So of those two, we're looking at the object negated by reasoning, okay, not the object negated by the path. And then again, making this identification of the object to be negated, we can think of a distinction between the object to be negated, which is the object, and the object to be negated, which is the subject. So within those two, then we're looking at the object to be negated, which is the the object to be negated, which is the object. So we're not negating the mind, the ignorance, we're negating the object grasped by that ignorance. And then again, what we were just saying of the difference between the observed object and then the aspect apprehended, we're negating the aspect apprehended, not the observed object.
다든다 똑배다점 세들라드니 지 양자지 세시 슈게지라스나 다든 최담제 똑배다점이 똑배다점인 하는 샤고레스 유디네 주가 충수제 요마레 스케지 시엔데 다든데 있나 똑배다바점게 똑배다점 강인 담지 요거르베스나 어디라 유비 네바 요마레스 와 똑배다바 세들라다 따주들라와 아니 가리레 다시 키지 숨된 게 되니 똑배다점 그 있나 가서 다시 기지 숨된 게 또배 따점이나 유배 잡스. 지난 또배 따점이나 유배 맞잡스. 나 딘적이 쉽지 지고 와. 디지도 다시 기지 숨된 수들이 와. 탄이게 채말라 잡아. 와. 아니 제가 탄이비 채매 미녀 봐. 된담게 채매 미녀 봤어. 나 딘적이 기지 숨된 게 또배 따점이나 예버도 요거를 했어. 지난 또배 따점이 맞점이 유배 예버 요 말이었어. 도시에다 된다비나 일본어 또배 따점 세전과 또배 따점당 강사 또배 따점 세다 뒤순이 또배 따바 세데 따점 세게 민직발에데 이나 또배 따점은 유명하게 개발돼 갔으나 직 아니 다시 기주 숨겨졌어. 내가 강사 또배 따점 세데 유비치도 또배 따점 세도 아니 단위기 세말라 잘대를 아니 콜라 단위비 세면 누구 말에 된담기 세면 누구 말했어. 다 딜레 신베로와 미규 최도도 똑배 따바 전달해 랑진 똑배 따좀 레데 있나요? 외고 뮤초와디 갈스나 아니 다시 기주 숨데 말했어. 뭐 탄이비 세말라 잘 말에 탄이비 세면 누구래 된담기 세면 누구래 어디 지연되다 똑배 따좀 세베나 덴바주와 랑싱 주바 점디 랑싱 주바디 랑진 똑배 따좀 줘와 베나 덴바주와 가자 된다 가자 된다 너 동반이 동료도 가자 된다 똑배 따좀 줘와 이내야 콜라 된담기 치면 누구와 가 된담기 치면 누구와디 가스나 된담 치면 꼭 매번 니고와 어디 지연데 다 노르수도나 다시 기주 숨된 게 때문에 똑배 따좀 생기나 요거 추그래 지당 똑배 따좀 이마점기 요거 추구 말해 진짜 똑배 따좀 디가 아니 쳐봤더니 제주 다 민다와 제바 민다와 니 두수 샤용도 오스
So then to explain a little bit more, make a little clearer what we were saying about phenomena being, or what it means to be merely designated by conceptual thought. Well, we could say that all phenomena are merely designated by conceptual thought, but is it also true that everything that is merely designated by conceptual thought is a phenomenon or exists? So no, because we have to be able to identify things which exist or are phenomena. There has to be a basis of designation that is qualified by three characteristics. Has to be qualified three things. So the first thing is that they have to be known in 직단 답하서그래 탄이 로이 답하서 탄이 세메도 답하서
이 정말 잡아서 다 지딩이
탄이 베세마라 답하. So that they have to be something which is renowned by valid conventional consciousnesses, valid conventional minds. They also have to be something which are not refuted by valid conventional minds, and they are also not refuted by valid ultimate minds. Okay, again, we can say ultimate pramana or conventional pramana. So it's a kind of consciousness which knows its object correctly and without error or misconceptions. So, so then if we ask about different kinds of things which are merely designated by conceptual thought, well, horns of a rabbit are merely designated by conceptual thought. True existence, right? Things established as truly existent, things established with their nature. Those are designated by conceptual thought. So the object negated by the wisdom that knows emptiness, that also is merely designated by conceptual thought. But those things don't exist, right? Because they are refuted by either conventional pramana or an ultimate pramana. So the horns of a rabbit are refuted by conventional pramana. A snake, the snake where a striped rope is refuted by conventional pramana, and then the true existence and existence with a nature, those are refuted by ultimate pramana, right? Valid ultimate mind. So all phenomena, whatever phenomena there are, they all are existent by way of being merely designated by conceptual thought. But when you flip that around, it is not true that all things that are merely designated by conceptual thought are phenomena or existent.
오야 다 도시 다 된다 뒤 죽좀 잡으시 다 된다 뒤 subject 난된도 또 어떻게 잡으시 다 뒤되네 다 외진 거에做的 아니 또베 다자 마인비 와 유바지 진주들라 아니 당시 마리바 스와 마리바 당시 마리바 세디 마리바부터 딘데지 외진미도니 다 뒤에 당시 마리바 되게 외진이 투발라 당신 되게 지다로 숨이 가자 다디 왜 신고하디 배 제치문에 제치문인 거디 다 팀의 말씀이 내게 당하나 좋디 나도 좀 뭐지 왕게 아니 코알라 양내도 제비 거든데라 주니 제왜 제가가 티팅에 다 드시 잡은 거래스 그래서니다 같이 다디 왜 숨어디 신분이 잡고 아니 민점 직접 많이 비도니다 셈나 예바팀이 돈이 왜 뭐지 답에 제치문에 진짜 제르지 제가 코와 좌우 세대보다 딘데와디스 좀 야해디 아니 가자 된다 문신디베 지우지 개우신 순수와 보다 주좀 디동에다 다른 subject들이 주좀 주기 있어.
So this is the final conclusion of this section about identifying the object to be negated. And within that section, this final concluding paragraph is pulling out the main meaning here of the whole section. And so once again, it's emphasizing the importance of identifying this object to be negated, saying that a mind which grasps some phenomenon to not be merely designated by conceptual thought. This is the ignorance that grasps self. This is self-grasping ignorance. And so that self-grasping ignorance has to be identified, and then the object which it's grasping has to be identified. That's extremely essential to do in order to stop the cycle of existence or samsara. So if we do not make this identification properly, then we will continue to cycle within cyclic existence. We will continue to cycle within samsara. So J Rinpoche, Tsongkhapa, is saying it is very, very important to identify this object to be negated. And so in this last paragraph, he is saying, you should understand. So in the Tibetan, that actually comes at the end of the sentence. So it's sort of more clearly like the sort of important instruction that is really, he's really, emphasizing, like, you must understand this. So the emphasis is a little stronger in the Tibetan phrasing of it. But anyway, the point is, you should understand this means you really must understand this. You must learn this. So okay, so now if there are questions, we can do a question and answer session.
Hello, ngate thomse shuejido.
Yes, yes.
The sigdi 당분이 리베 각차 인라 치만이 탄예도 되베 미가고스는 당부디다 당아주 민자 따유기 나페디로와 땐중기 나페 디각 각차체 안디네 탄예도 라버지나 빼자시는 건 녜라고 라버지나 녜라고페 녜페디 디 각차 말에 디스고를 튼다.
So the questioner Karma is asking about the section, a few paragraphs, just in the paragraph above, where it says, of these two, the former is the object negated by reason, whereas the latter is accepted conventionally, so it is not refuted. So he's just trying to get more clear. He's confused about what that's referring to. So he's saying, is it that the first one is the object refuted by reason is the mere I that exists in dependence on the aggregates, whereas the second one is the I, which is like the I that when we think my hand, my foot, is it that I thinking my, my stuff, is that the difference that we're supposed to understand here?
So the Kamala Sona shi di tataji kowa di demido ha di kasa mingyang tayo tsamji da di gaja resna di jigo mar mingyang tayo tsamgi da di yore kasana mingyang tayo tsamgi da se di mingde sha tsamdang rangi dashila tuyne juba se o tinde di o tanye du yugi da diri tinda di tangbo di doa di tangbo ni ribi gaja ila se ribi gaja di rangi tsini jubi no nyambe singe lodigi chidara zimbi yujerwa rangshing jubi ngajerwa rangshing jubi ngadi ani ribi gaja res ta tanyedo ngao nyamba jerwa ta pungola tabi ngazamla mini ngao nyambe lui chidara zimbi yu ani pungola tabi ngazamdi ani ribi gaja mare sin shibja di chigo modo jigi mingyang tayo zamgi daadi lamna ta di yugendirida mingyang tayo zamgi daadi ribi gaja shanda jigo marba mingyang tayo zamgi daadi yu sedi mingde 샤zam기 다 소리 탄여도 유비 다들이 와 다는 같이 다디 민양 따여서 말이 mingde 샤zam 많이 비 여바스도 mingde 샤발라 마디오바들이 와 그전에 디베트 고란디 민양 따여서기 다세도 리비 가자라 샤 말에 스타트 까말라 슈에들 다들 당보 리비 가자이 치마디 가자 말에 세기 당보디 가리리 니바 가리리 했으니 깨지셔 와 있나 지달 현직이 지달 숨이 와 랑싱 주비 나디 아니 각자 조어들레스 와 이 랑신 주변 가스나 민대 샤자 많이 비여받으라서 그러와 단 탄예도 유가 나오냐 바지도 와대 나오냐 바 짬기 루유라 다도 제바스디 탄 민단 민대 양사 뒤로와 풍보라 답이 나점라 나오 세저라 풍보 답이 나점디라 아니 강사 나시하네 오디 나오 님비 루이기 유도 주위 풍보라 답이 나점기 아니 나점디 아니 리비 가자 말해 티 요레스 팀 아니 민장 따요점기 다들 디레 무슨 민장 따요점기 다들 리비 가자 전지 무스 어디 말해스 데 수혜를 저디 나서
토치나.
So that's not exactly the right understanding that Karma was asking, or that he was asking if his understanding was correct. So Geshe is saying that's not exactly the correct understanding of what's intended in this section. So first it's saying the former is the object negated by reason, and so if we ask, well, the self, or the I, which is merely which exists as a mere designation, which is a self which is merely existent as being designated by names only. Is that the object negated by reason? No, that's not negated by reason, because that kind of I exists. So that kind of I conventionally exists. It's the conventional I, the mind which thinks merely conventionally thinks I, which is the I that is designated in dependence upon the aggregates. So that I exists, the I which is designated upon the aggregates, because we can say also the I which is merely designated by names and terms, language essentially, the I merely designated by language, that I exists. So it's not the object negated by reason. So what is the I that is negated by reason? The I that is established by way of its own characteristics. The I that is established by way of its own character. So that's the I that's negated by reason. So what is that again? It's an I which does not exist, because it would be an I that is not merely designated by language and names and terms. So any sense of an I that is not merely designated by names and terms, that's an I that doesn't exist, which is negated by reason. But the I that is merely designated by names and terms, or the I that is conventionally existent I, that exists. So just when you think I, me, just that mere thought of I and me is conventionally existent in dependence upon the aggregates, that I exists. But the I that doesn't exist, again, is the one negated by reason, and it is also the object, which is the apprehended object of the innate view of the perishing aggregates. So that this is what was being looked at by J. Rinpoche, is this innate, identifying sort of this root of samsara, the innate view of the perishing aggregates, and seeing how the aspect that's apprehended by that mind, the innate view of the perishing aggregates, that is the I which doesn't exist, the object to be negated. So,
또 근데 디가나 연자 민장 다유 쓰기 뒤에서와 디라 지시지 연자 쉬쉬는 민장 다유 좀게 다디 요래 세고 되거든 민 디라 된다는 일이고 민장 다유 민장 쓰도 민대 샤점 디라 쓰고 다유 쓰도 랑이 다시라 되는 주바스 와 랑이 다시라 되는 주바 와 랑이 다시라 되는 주바디라 다유스 디치도 다랑이 다 민대 샤바등 랑이 다시라 되는 주바이나 요걸 그래서 다 민장 다유점에 다디 유스 어디 다디 탄유도 유기 다이나 민장 다유점에 다인데 찹 이거를 다 같이 다스도 민장 다유점 로조도 차와 민대 샤자 많이 봐 랑이 다시라 되는 주바 많이 비 아니 다든지 니규 다지 계속 유나 다든지 니와 니규 다디 요마로 이나 다든지 니규 요겐기 있더니 다라디 같이 다디 차와 와 유전 디지도 다 민장 다요점이 다당 안 다든지 니규 다니 직가자 다든지 다니 다든지 니바티라 아니 다 야 민대 샤자만 비여바들 다시니 디 가자리 당면 또 비셔비 가이 가자당 주비 가이 가자 디레스 와 단 민장 따요 점세디 아니 민데 샤점당 장기 다시를 뛰는 주바 오다 니조 인게디 요월 디나 요비 잡스 와 민장 따요 점디 이나 예버도 요월에 와 야 민데 샤점 이바 점디 예버도 요월 말이스 단 민장 따요 점세디 민데 샤점당 다시를 뛰는 주바 니조 다 딜리고 딜라드다 유규 취지라모도 유미규 취 메겐지가 디민장 다유세디 민장 세디리데 다유세디 링고 나 민장다 다유 니가 추초와이나 다 예버도 요거에 다 지금 다 탐제 민장 다유 점이 세디 다 둘다 디레 내가 또배 파다 점당 아니 랑이 다시라 뛰는 그바 어떤 디니 소리 소도 디레스 어디 니베데
So just to add a little more clarity to that, what it means to be merely designated as only names. So that there's an important phrasing, merely designated as only names. Well, we can take this apart into the two separate phrases. So merely designated and then only names. So the first one we'll look at is, what does it mean to say merely only names? We'll look at first. And so only names is meaning something which is designated posited by terms and words, or in other words, posited by language, posited by language, names and terms. Whereas I'm saying merely designated, but I should be saying merely existing as merely designated. And yeah, a designated existent. Actually, that's I think what I really should be saying. So we're saying a designated existent that is only names. Designated existent that is only names. So only names is something that is posited by language, names, and terms. And then designated existent means that it is something which is established independence upon its basis of designation. So if something is both of these, merely, sorry, I keep saying, so it's the phrasing is either designated existent as only names, but sometimes it's also merely existent. Sorry, you have to like switch. Designated existent merely. Yeah, it's sometimes you just add a word, the term merely there. So merely existent as designated as only names. Something like that would become. So if something is both of these, is designated existent and and only names, then it exists. Something that is both of those exists. However, if something is just only names, then it doesn't necessarily exist. So something which is just designated by language and terms doesn't necessarily exist. And so the things which are the opposite of being merely designated, I shouldn't say things which are, but the opposite of being merely the opposite of only names, or being designated by only names. Sorry, the opposite of existing is being designated by only names. That doesn't exist, and that is sort of what if we it's the sense that if we go to look for it within the object of designation, the basis of designation, and we look for the object designated, then something findable there. So it's something findable when we look for the designated object when we within the basis of designation. That is the opposite of being an only name, or being designated by name in terms and language. So that doesn't exist. But if something is only, so something to exist, it has to be both of these. It has to be only names and it has to be a designated existent. And so if something is only name but not a designated existent, then it doesn't exist. But something to be, yeah.
멜로디 단다디 랑신기 주베 나디 아니 각자 인수로 단다디 단다디
라서 랑신 주비 나디오
러스
랑신
So
주비
just to clarify.
랑신 주비 나디 가자 인세 랑신 주비 나디야 아디니 민데 샤자 마이 비 요바딜라 랑신 주비 나시 오다 디 아니 가스나 가자 샤이게들 다디 메바 니드드니 동이 또 세계지디 시고로 와 이제 다 나세게디니 나디 진난들라 다음에 세계 다디 민데 샤자 마이 비 요바딜라 다시니 팀메 아니 어디 지미로들라 아니 가스나 당진시 오다 tinda 당신 주변나 세디다 tinda 디게 가자디 오다로 tinda 가마라 소는 시 다라는 주스 그래서
러스 토친
So Garma is clarifying. So then the I which exists with its nature, with a nature, that's the object to be negated, right? So Genla said, yes, that is the object to be negated, the I which exists with a nature. And so the I which is established with a nature, that is the object to be negated. And also it is the I which is not dependent on being labeled, not posited by names and terms that are posited by mere names. So whatever kind of mind is grasping an I that is not posited by mere names, not merely designated, sorry, I should say the whole thing, right? It is not designated existent as a mere name. If it is not grasping something as not that, grasping the I as not that, then that is the ignorance that is to be negate, grasping the object to be negated, and that's the object to be negated, its object. And then the wisdom which realizes that it doesn't exist, that's the wisdom realizing emptiness, the wisdom realizing selflessness. So seeing that the I which is not designated existent, that's posited by mere names, seeing that that doesn't exist is the wisdom which realizes emptiness.
If I ask a question, can Kalsang Danya hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I think so. Go ahead.
Oh boy. Okay, so I might be totally confused. Well, I am totally confused. The statement that you made that all phenomena are designated by conceptual thought, but not all things designated by conceptual thought are phenomena. My question is about karma. Is karma phenomena, or is it? And if
Yeah.
so, the selflessness of karma.
What about the selflessness of karma?
Is there selflessness? What is it? Is there the selflessness of karma?
Okay. 재정 또배 파타바점 그래서 제점실 또배 파타바점 means 또배 파타바점 얘나 여배마 caps so the any this 독보여스 가르쳐나 레김제 기nomshagdi any chutang le sayati leje yang le sayati chorebes any leje gi dagme yorebes le gi dagme
다음에서는 감에
dagme
알레 레디 다음에로
le gi dagme
다 레디 진짜 최레스로 다 레디 또 배다서 임바디 가스나 레디드니 레세디드니 가스나 그런 게 다시든 세나 다든지 니에죠 말이에요. 와 다시든 그런 게 다시든 레세디 가스나 아니 가리래 달 진짜 레 기회래 나는 미개발래 다 니바도 샤와 다 니바도디 니바디 제가 좋아이나 아 세니 디 레레 스니다 니바 대점기 돈이더니 얘기 되니 가리래 저와 진누버지 그치 시험으로 디 주시디 아니 가리 다된전에 니균이 이게 마다 맞으면서는 유게 다신 집에서는 레대야 바 차체수나 아니 한 고랑의 니바디 야 창가지 깨지 시는데 양고 시중으로 자루라 해서 다도 세니 아니 고랑의 디니 시디 때문에 샤메상 로이 파다점 매바리에서는 매와 말했어 저와 진리고 그랬어 그래서 또배 따점긴 아니 저와 진리비 얘기 전에 최 레대야 최기랑 신제스 최세 대한 유유 이루가 시주가让你我怎么写就了让你我怎么去给经济什么的具体拿到工作结果了让你我怎么人明天下怎么人让你大写的对你主管人是이 나양 아니 그明天下怎么着的가르쳐 것은 투모만 비디롱은 주요 말했어 어디 지고 알았어 뭐 도양 고랑이 뭐는 요 말했어 라고 말했어 어디 이거 되시죠
So, am I muted? No, okay. So, yes, karma is a phenomenon. Yes, karma is a phenomenon, and to say that it is merely designated by conceptual thought, what does that mean? It means that it is something which is not found when you look for it within its basis of designation. Okay, it is not found when you look for it within its basis of designation. That's what it means to be merely designated by thought. And so when you look at, well, what is karma, whether you're talking about virtuous karma, non-virtuous karma, it's basically we're talking about a potentiality. So this potential, so it's something that is merely the ability to do actions, right? It's the ability to have some function or to do some action. So it when we don't analyze and make an investigation into its nature, then it exists, it appears and it exists and it is able to function. When we make an analysis and investigation into its nature, then we don't find it among its basis of designation. Okay, so if we ask, well, does it then not exist? No, it doesn't not exist. So it exists, it's a phenomenon. And by the way, just as again, this sort of, kind of basic foundational Buddhist ontology or philosophy, but existent and phenomenon are equivalent. So they mean the same thing. Also established base. There's several different terms used to describe anything which exists. So phenomenon. So why is it a phenomenon then? Because yes, it is something which well, the definition of phenomenon is described as something which holds its own identity. So it does. Karma does have its own identity, or it sort of holds its own identity. And again, so when we're saying that it's selfless, that it doesn't have a self, then self of phenomena, then we're saying that it doesn't exist by way of having its own sort of unique status in the world as being its own unique way of existing or unique status that is by itself. It doesn't exist in that way, but it is a phenomenon, and it does exist when we're not making an analysis and investigation into its nature. Okay.
Something I have a question.
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Oh, okay. So first, I just wanted to thank Geshe for being so patient and for going through these teachings so carefully, and taking this time to help us understand. And then my question is just so this one word always throws me, the word aspect, which I think in Tibetan is Nampo. So when it's translated to English, somehow
understand it, so that means I don't understand it in Tibetan either. Maybe just a little bit more explanation of exactly what that means.
Okay, great. So I'll just start by making a short translator's note as so yes, this is a term that is right difficult, I think, for most people. But it's and so this is just from sort of observing the different terminology that is available and commonly used, it seems like the actual terminology of the cognitive sciences and contemporary psychology could be maybe borrowed in this case to make it a little more clear. And this is why I tend to prefer the term used in the sciences, which is a cognitive appraisal. So I tend to not say aspect, but instead say the cognitive appraisal or the sense of cognitive appraisal or something like that. But that also requires you to then kind of learn what they're talking about when they use that term. But anyway, so gen la dambo gen la in kapane tuche nang kang gale 14번 전에 된다 그 samata shaking 도 같은 시 아니 단다 주요 가르쳐나 단다 넘버서 디페나 number 유 가서 我每个有的 number 有你呢是那些，아니 저当 number 设的个错给们都是 number 给吞的 ，number 是被自己吞的的，아니 number 设的看的是个个的。
다들 넘버 지라 넘버들 지당은 듯이 제도 신nom다 되는지 니도 듯이 겨워와 다든다 넘버디 요 말이었어 미바디 요 말이었어 근데 지다들 깨지 신데 지다디 넘버디 시디 지다기 지들 지마들 지다기 가리신 거를 나랑 신기 주고 증거 와 그냥 나랑 신기 주고 그 지에들라 넘버체 아니 키버 시소에들라 미바스 와 이당 넘버 세대 그 지역이 진단되라 넘버 이제 지디기 넘버디 매바 도워리면 미바디 매바 도고 말스 당면도 비셔라디 지대기 진단되라 소라 진단되라 넘버션 진단되라 다운데 넘버 세대다 갑디 고역의 넘버디 진단되라 고어리스 진단기 유디라 진단 그 지혜저와 그나 랑싱이 주바 진바리스 강사 미바체 랑싱이 주바디 넘버 넘버 인바데 가서 그 진당 차로 진당이 유차로 자 진당이 유들은 넘버스 갑디 넘버디 진당이 유들어서 그래서 어디라다.
So yes, so when we're talking about the in general making a description of aspect, then we actually make a difference between the consciousness aspect and the object aspect. So that's one general way of kind of explaining this notion of aspect. But here, when we're talking about in this section, when we were talking about the view of the perishing aggregates and how, oh well, the aspect of apprehension doesn't exist, the observed object does exist. Okay, so in this context, what we're saying, the aspect of apprehension, that is just the way that that's the aspect of the way that the mind is apprehending. Okay, so it's also called the apprehended object, the object of the mode of apprehension. If you're familiar with some of Professor Jeffrey Hopkins, in his sort of tradition of translation, often he used that phrasing, the object of the mode of apprehension. This is again looking at cognitive science. It's very similar to the phrasing of the cognitive appraisal, or the object of the cognitive appraisal. So it's just saying that the aspect here is the way that cognizing, apprehending, grasping the object, and then the observed object is the thing which is the basis of characterization, the basis of specifying qualities, or the basis of making a specification is the observed object. The way it's being apprehended, or the apprehended object, the cognized object, cognitive appraisal, etc., that's the aspect.
So that
the he's just saying what is the called Tanyegi Gola Ketchuti singing Lengiagora. So the question came as a message in the chat. What is the Tibetan word for aspect? Can you spell it or pronounce it slowly? So it is nampa, and nampa is spelled in Tibetan ra nata na ma nam, but in English you would say, if you're doing the Wiley transcription, it's R-N-A-M, and if you're spelling it like the way it sounds, it's just N-A-M-P-A. So I'll write it in the chat for those who want to see it. With the Wiley transcription, R-N-A-M space P-A. Okay, and then it's just N-A-M-P-A if you want to pronounce it properly. Number. Okay. That's okay.
我说对，那把谁就是话，那把记者赢了的，我跟搞说了，他必须当对的这些家人们的，之前他们那把他们谁去他们那把去下去的话，搞起来开始了，我电视的那把电把戏的那把谁的，那电把戏结束了，讲的谢谢的话，估计搞到给家人们都那把谁的之前记者都是这事。아니 직탁이 미바다 직탁이 넘버세디 진당 넘버들 갑디 넘버디 진당 코어레스.
So actually this Tibetan word nampa is a very common word that has many different meanings in different contexts. So it really has to be taken per each individual context to understand what it's implying or what it's referring to. So we can talk about there's the phrasing of all nampa. I'll just use the Tibetan to make it clear. So all nampa, but that just means all phenomena when we say all nampa. And then you could also say the nampa of the four truths. The nampa of the four truths is now referring to the individual characteristics of each of the four truths. Okay, so there it means something different. And in this context, when we're talking about the nampa object, right, we're talking about the apprehended object, the way that the mind, the sense or the cognitive appraisal that the mind is apprehending its object as being. So now time is over, so we'll stop the class today.
日日俱习面多张忙日热灵犀年的电报的三界许多面的不忘这个南大西拉去吧说也他妈过让那们大呀米抗日热为过为天堂的话，马律中面的节日希望电子家族，下边谁的巴多电主机，家庭对接工作之类，到处大别龙多接近的，来些那么日了忙对面。南端这位写了所完的长久深久人不解马街把那么解决解话娘把没把样光年光该话说他自那个谁为没解不什么点着他当这位的怕着路主要在光吧七夕光多区别就如我结瓦地结我归说那么一些做些说那么一些列中为他把姑娘多把它说天就对起切不那一条
Geshe 나왔습니다. 나고.
Geshe.